Hello, this is Molly McCaffrey and analysis assignment 2. We're going to be going over 4 things today, so let's get started. The first one is going to be key moments in the history of abortion and kind of the changes in how society has both accepted and rejected abortion over time. So just for reference, in the mid-1600s, a pregnant couple who was not married would be encouraged to get married by friends, family, and the court. And if the male decided not to or refused, he would be whipped or fined for the crime of fornication. And by the 1740s, discussions of concern over the true determination of paternity was enough of a difficult discussion because there were no true paternity tests that they decided to decriminalize fortification, but because really they could only apply that to men, and it was still obvious if a woman was pregnant and she was not married. So that decriminalization of fornication only applied to men. So this led to the idea that anyone who wanted an abortion wanted it because they were ashamed of their premarital sex, which was not always the case, as you will see, because in 1742 in Pomfret, Connecticut, there was a case of a young couple about 10 years apart where they fell pregnant and he did not want to marry her, and she wanted to keep the baby. She told him she would hide his identity and parent the child alone, but he eventually convinced her to get an abortion. At this time, abortion methods were preferred to be done using herbs, but at 5.5 months, Sarah was still pregnant and seemingly without consent of either her or her lover. She was given an abortion, and the stress that the doctor caused inside of her caused her to die too. She died within like a month. What's kind of important to take away from this is that after Sarah's death, all the women involved showed a lot of remorse, especially through God and worship, and none of the men really showed guilt, or if it was shame related to the family, and the problem wasn't that she had an abortion, it was that, like, she died. Like, yes, they knew that abortion, they believed that abortions were a sin, but that wasn't their focus. The focus was on the fact that Sarah died. It did end up going to court a couple years later, and her lover was never convicted. The doctor was, but he fled and escaped conviction or escaped jail. And yeah, it was a case that really supported the idea that abortion was not rare, nor was the idea of male patriarchy and male supremacy. By the 1800s, women started to realize that childbirth was more so a time of terror for them than really a time of celebration. And so they practiced abstinence or got married later in life. And when this wasn't successful, in avoiding pregnancy. Women attempted to have abortions with themselves. It actually wasn't scrutinized that often when women did this, because fetuses were not considered human until they started moving in the womb. Really, just because you didn't even know if you were pregnant. The technology wasn't available to know if someone was pregnant until really they felt the movement of the infant. And so it wasn't until that phase which is called quickening, where it became like somewhat illegal. And yeah, this debate between like quickening and unquickening, whether that's the distinction or where the distinction lines, that's it would prove a crucial debate over history, and it still does. As I mentioned before, women attempted to abort themselves with home medical literature that contained information about abortifacients that gave women readily access to a list of procedures deemed capable at the time to be done to oneself by oneself. And with this being the 19th century, was full of abortion methods and knowledge. It really was. It also meant that a high proportion of women who received abortions were not just single unmarried women anymore, because now that childbirth was kind of seen more as a time of terror, which it really wasn't. A lot of male doctors insinuated to women that if they gave birth they would die, and unfortunately there weren't a lot of female doctors, but the ones that were that was never a case, or at least rarely it was a case that a woman died during childbirth. So yeah, because childbirth was now seen as this time of terror, and it wasn't just single women, a lot of women were starting to be seen as self-indulgent. However, there was also a view that partners were being responsible. It was finally the time to choose, like to advocate for yourself when you wanted to have a baby. As I mentioned, fertility rates got smaller and smaller. Abortion rates nearly doubled. Even after World War II and the occurrence of the baby boom, abortions were still rising. Regardless, a majority of the medical professions still highly rejected the idea of abortion. However, and ironically, in 1933, a medical doctor released a literature basically extracting all the human rights from a baby fetus, and it opened up the door to new ideas being behind reasoning and moral rights of abortion and more of that conversation. But it didn't really change much. Before Roe v. Wade in 1973, the only way to have an abortion after quickening was by using an underground system of abortionists called the Janes. Janes safely performed about 11,000 abortions between 1968 and 1973 for free or low cost. And then Roe v. Wade was passed, and now, almost 50 years later, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, determining abortions once again, to be unconstitutional. The decision is widely criticized, but of course it wouldn't have changed if the debate over the morality of abortion was not still occurring. So, as history has shown us time and time again, there will always be beliefs on both sides of the story. There has been and there always will be. The next topic we're going to go into is the history of the reproductive justice movement. So Loretta Ross is one of 12 women who initiated the reproductive justice movement. And in a podcast, Loretta Ross explains that the reproductive justice movement focuses on ways to bring communities and movements affected by reproductive policies to advocate for the full human rights and justice of everyone. So there's basically 3, and some could say 4, basic elements to this. So one is that every human has the right to choose whether or not they want to have a baby, and that includes using pill, abortion, condoms. The second one is that you have the right to have, if you want to have a child, you have the right to have it under the circumstances you wish, whether that's a water birth in a hospital with an epidural, whether you want a cesarean section or not. That is all your choice. The third is the right to raise children in safe and healthy environments. And the fourth is the right to your own gender identity and the right to sexual pleasure. So the reproductive justice movement all kind of started when Hillary Clinton made a pitch to a pro-choice feminist conference to help support a healthcare reform proposal. And the problem was that they decided to avoid referencing abortion or including abortion. And they did this because they figured that if they didn't mention abortions in the public health reform, that it would be more likely supported by Republicans. But the problem is, how do you support female health and pro-choice ideology and not include abortions? Reproductive health care is women health care. To assess health care, you need to look at it as an intersection analysis. If someone does not want a pregnancy, it might not mean that they don't want a baby. It might mean that they don't make enough money, that they don't live in a safe environment, that they don't have health care. There's many reasons. And so within that issue lays the issue of unequal health care, specifically because Black women have a harder time getting contraceptives or affordable ones. They have higher rates of pregnancy, and then they have higher rates of abortions, and it's all a cycle. So, well, just for one thing, it's the reproductive justice movement really wants to focus on holistic analysis, starting with universal health care. It's hard to even make a decision about your life, about your choices, about your reproductive choices when you don't even have access to all of those choices. So like I said, people need to have a holistic analysis in which the context of one's lives impact their decisions on their reproductive choices. So the third point that we're going to be going into is how sexual violence has operated historically with respect to race and class in the U.S. Sharon Block calls rape sexual coercion, and it was not only sexual coercion was not only common, but it was even a cause for court proceedings dating back to the early 1800s. It was usually children. At this time, it was usually children, those who had been born during the odd era of a change in civil rights and new states, which meant some kids, although their parents were free, were still enslaved until the age of 28. And then there were some loopholes around laws that meant local officials could take children and replace them in homes to work. And for these reasons, and the fact that the children were just exhausted after a long day or days of work, led them to become vulnerable to the sexual coercion of the authority figures around them. And this became a trend of white male figures sexually coercing women, specifically black women. In 1959, 4 men abducted and raped a female Florida A&M student who was black. All 4 men were caught and admitted to their guilt, and none of them were worried. One of them was more worried about the damage to his car. Students of A&M were furious. They were outraged. It wasn't the fact that they went out to rape a woman. It was the fact that they went out to rape a black woman. And when it came to time to trial, and after a mountain of evidence, the 4 men were found guilty with a recommendation for mercy, which a recommendation for mercy basically just means not the death penalty, which was never the case for a black man accused of raping a white woman. And it just started to become consistent to see white people commit crimes against black people and not serving justice. And that's still a problem. We still see that problem here today, unfortunately. The 4th point I'm going to be going into is carceral feminism and abolitionist feminism. So carceral feminism is it's an approach that sees increased policing, prosecution, and imprisonment as the main solution to violence against women. So an example of this would be facing the maximum punishment after being found guilty of domestic violence toward a female. And abolitionist feminism is kind of the opposite. It seeks to end the policing and the prison system. So an example of someone who an example would be of someone may not being put on trial, but instead being put through a mental health assessment and proper treatment thereafter, instead of a trial and jury system. The community would have resources to avoid this in the first place, things like that. But yeah, that is all I have for today. Thanks for listening, and you have a good one. Bye-bye.